Welcome back to Yu-Gi-Oh! History with Joe Giorlando. In today's video, we are going to take a look at Fire Fists for the very first time. So at the recording of this video, obviously Fire Formation Tenki is a playable card. It is at 3, it is very popular obviously in Tri-Brigades and had previously been popular in Zoo decks, but the very first time that Fire Fist Formation Tenki and all of the Fire Fist cards were popular was at the end of 2012 with the release of Cosmic Blazer. In that set, we had cards like Fire Fist Bear, Fire Fist Gorilla, and of course, Fire Formation Tenki. This trap-based deck at the end of 2012 competed with other decks like Mermills, Windups, the early incarnations of Geargias, and really situated itself as one of the most powerful trap-based decks of that format. Of course, in 2013, particularly this summer, things changed with the release of Dragon Rulers and Spellbook of Judgment. I've made that comment in previous videos, but Fire Fist were then even playable again in 2014. We'll talk about those 2014 builds at a later date. The video today is going to look at some of the earliest versions of Fire Fist, versions that combine, yes, some Fire Fist monsters, specifically ones like Bear and Gorilla, but also a tour guide / Rescue Rabbit package. Now, when you decided to run Rescue Rabbit in this particular deck, you had really two options. The first option was just run 3 normals, which is what I'll be doing today. Usually that's Gene Warped Werewolf, a beast warrior that can be searched off Rescue Rabbit. Sometimes that was Vorse Raider. Vorse Raider plus Tenki gets a monster above a DDV or Deck Devastation Virus threshold, so there was some utility there. Or you ran 3 of those, 3 Gene Warp, 3 Vorse Raider, and Sabersaurus, creating what was often referred to as Dino Fist. I personally, even though I'm obviously a big fan of Sabersaurus with Rescue Rabbit, electing to choose just 3 Gene Warped Werewolves. So I'm going to have a much smaller normal monster package. I feel like this deck was one of those decks that didn't need to rely on the Evolzars nearly as much as other decks, and one of the things that came up a lot with running original Dino Rabbit was using 2 dinosaurs throughout the game to make Evolzars. Well, if the only monsters you run that are dinosaurs are just 3 Sabersaurus, you don't have those situations where you have a Dirac Gwaiba and a Sabersaurus or a Cabazals that make Lagia / Stolka. And if you happen to draw one of each normal monster, 1 Sabersaurus and 1 Gene Warp Werewolf, again, you're kind of locked in to only certain Exceed monsters, and you don't have that utility of making Evolzars kind of periodically through the game without ever drawing Rescue Rabbit, which I always thought was a major strength of Dino Rabbit, the original Dino Rabbit deck. So I'm only going to run 3 normal monsters. But today we're going to look at some of the original Fire Fist decks. I'm going to use sort of the base of what Mike Steinman used at the sealed YCS in San Jose, a YCS that was originally sealed for the first portion of the event and then transitioned into constructed for the top cut and for the final rounds of Swiss. I'm also going to get some inspiration from other players who had success at events like YCS Miami in 2012 and some of the events early in 2013. But again, the cutoff for this deck in terms of its playability turning into 2013 was when the Dragon Rulers and Spellbook of Judgment was released. And these cards often were pushed off to the side until we finally saw limitations to some of those power cards, when this deck would return to playability in 2014. But anyway, without further ado, let's take a deep dive look at the very first time that Fire Fists were considered a competitive deck in the Yu-Gi-Oh! Scene. All right, we'll start the deck with the monsters as we typically do. This deck is going to include Rescue Rabbit, so we are going to run 3 copies of Gene Warped Werewolf, a really cool looking ultimate rare. It's really funny what normal monsters over the course of Yu-Gi-Oh's history have had playability. Gene Warp Werewolf, absolutely one of them for a small period of time. Some of these decks elected to run Sabersaurus, as I commented on in the introduction. Like I mentioned though in the introduction, this is strictly a Fire Fist deck. It's not a Dino Fist deck, so we are not going to be running Sabersaurus. We are also not going to be running other Beast Warriors like Vorse Raider. We are just sticking with 3 Gene Warped Werewolves. So it is true Rescue Rabbit can only resolve once. Past that point, we have 3 copies of Fire Fist Bear and 1 copy of Gorilla. So this is our Fire Fist package. We have 3 bears and 1 gorilla. Bear, obviously a little bit better than gorilla. That's why we see the ratio as it is currently constituted. You can just pop a monster, attack, search out another copy of Tenki, make it so that on the next turn you can flip Tenki and kind of do this almost Inzektor-like chain of events where if your opponent can't stop you, you're going to generate card advantage because each of the bears themselves let you search out additional copies of Tenki. And then Gorilla's there sort of as a utility spot. Sometimes you can pop a Fiendish Chain and that will free a Gorilla or something else, and then you can take advantage of that. So that's our Fire Fist package. Then we have the Rabbit package. We have 2 copies of Rabbit. Again, it was limited to 2, and 2 copies of Tour Guide, also limited to 2. And we actually also have 2 copies of Tengu. So Reborn Tengu, a card that obviously a lot of people have familiarity with. It basically had its own format, Tengu Plants. At this point in Yu-Gi-Oh's history, it's limited to 2, but it's actually a card that we can search off Tenki. It gives us a little bit of utility with Tenki because let's say you have a really good read on Bottomless Trap Hole, and you think to yourself, well, it's not Dimension Prison, I can't search Gorilla. It's not like I can just search Tenki off a Tenki, a Gorilla, pop the Deep Prison, and attack. I think it's Bottomless. Well, if you search anything else, it's just going to get hit by Bottomless. Tenki applies a lot of pressure, so I know it's limited to 2, and that might seem awkward, but it has some utility there. The monster lineup's really low, though this is the type of deck with the way some of the numbers work where you wouldn't mind something like Pot of Avarice, because putting back the normal monsters or a copy of Tengu or even both Tengus can make it so that you have additional copies throughout the game, making it so the second Rabbit's live. But honestly, you're really just trying to maximize the early window of the game and make it so that some of these ratios don't end up hurting you. But that is our monster lineup. Next, we'll move into our spell lineup. So we have 3 copies of Mystical Space Typhoon. This card was good against basically every single deck, minus a couple, which is basically usually the case in triple Typhoon formats, but it's obviously great in the mirror match. You can hit Tenki. There's literally 15 plus trap cards that you could hit, so there's a ton of utility there. Against Mermills, which was probably the best deck during this format, you can obviously hit Spear. A lot of those decks ran a pretty reasonable amount of traps themselves, so there's some utility there. When you play against Windups, which was another top deck, yes, that deck was a Shockmaster deck at this point, but what that ultimately means is they're not going to hit your hand with Windup Hunter, so that usually means the game is going to go a bit longer, and as a result, you want to MST the Windup factories that hit the board so that they don't generate a ton of card advantage. It's a very grindy matchup, and having MST in your deck make sure that that goes through. Past that, you're probably going to face a Dino Rabbit deck here or there. It's obviously great to Typhoon something and push a playthrough, so having 3 MSTs was really critical in almost all of the top matches. So 3 MSTs, obviously 3 copies of Tenki, that's self-explanatory. This deck is the original deck running copies of Tenki we see in modern Yu-Gi-Oh, at least at the point in which this video is recorded, Tenki having playability, but this is a Fire Fist deck where Fire Formation Tenki originally saw its playability, allowing us obviously to search out Bear, Gorilla, but also cards like Reborn Tengu. Then some additional cards. We have a couple copies of Forbidden Lance in a format where people are jamming triple D Prison, multiple Bottomlesses, just a ton of trap cards. Cards like Forbidden Lance are really strong. In the grind game, Forbidden Lance is one of the best cards because it's flexible. You can use it as a pseudo Sakuratsu armor in the damage step when your opponent is receiving an attack. You can also use it as a pseudo smashing ground by attacking and then activating it in damage step, so it works both ways. You can protect the monster from Dark Hole, Deep Prison, Bottomless. I don't have to explain this too much, but the flexibility of a card like Forbidden Lance in a grindy format has always been really awesome. A couple of copies of Pot of Duality. It's a point in Yu-Gi-Oh's history where people still really value Pot of Duality. This deck can special summon, but a lot of the turns it really doesn't. Even just searching Bear, popping a monster, attacking, searching another Tenki, there's no special summoning involved. So this deck can really get away with running a couple of copies of Duality. And then some power one-ups. We have Heavy Storm, pseudo staple. This deck has a lot of traps in it, but you're going to play mirror matches. You want a card like Heavy Storm. Dark Hole, pseudo staple. Reborn, pseudo staple. And then 1 copy of Tensu, which is the second type of Fire Fist card that you can search. The build that I'm profiling elected not to run any of the traps, which I think makes a lot of sense. I don't really like the traps. So 1 additional Fire Fist card. It allows you to make Abyss Dweller, allows you to make rank 4s when you think it's worthwhile. So an additional Fire Formation spell there. Going on to the trap lineup, there are a lot of traps in this deck. We have 3 copies of Dimensional Prison. This is a suspect card, a tough card when you're going to be running against a lot of Mermail decks, but the logic that Mike Steinman and a lot of players who elected to run this deck had was that matchup in game 1 is always going to be tough. At that point in time, Mermail Atlanteans were so powerful with 3 Dragoons and the Diva package, and they didn't always run the Gen X package, but sometimes they could, and they just got Abystius. I mean, the deck was so powerful. It was really hard to win game 1. As a result, if you hedged against some of the grindy trap decks like Dino Fists, Fire Fists, Wind-Ups, a variety of other decks, you could win a lot of those grindy games where the outcome of the game is a little bit more in your hands. And having cards like Deep Prison are perfect because when you're playing against a player and you can sequence your traps effectively, take advantage of things, Deep Prison them at the perfect time, you end up winning a lot of games. And in order to do that, you have to kind of concede the fact that Deep Prison is not the greatest card in the world against Mermails. It's kind of one of those cards you have to keep in your hand, right? You allow your opponent to invest into your board. Hopefully that gets rid of their marksman. And then after they've invested into the board, now you set Deep Prison. The risk there, of course, is that deck could be running Mooling Glacia. They could just have more marksmen. It's really hard to pinpoint a good time to use Prison, which is also true with Mirror Force. But if you have these cards against some of the more grindy matchups like I commented on, it allows you to survive, prolong the game, take advantage of maybe your more familiarity with the matchup and the format. So That's why we have 5 of these. They also combo really well with some of the cards in the side deck, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Then we have Fiendish Chain, which actually was good against Mermills. A lot of times you want to just set this card against Mermills, because if your opponent goes Marksman off of Pike or Abystius, you basically generate card advantage there. Like, for example, your opponent summons Pike, discards Marksman with the intention of popping your back row and searching. You just chain Fiendish Chain, and now they're down the card in their hand, and they have a 1600 on the board. They can't attack. Now, they could theoretically use that for an Exceed monster, so you're kind of just 1-for-1 with the Marksman there, but you're stopping the search, so you are stopping and hindering their overall game plan, and they invested 2 cards into your Fiendish Chain. Same is true with the Abystius. So Fiendish Chain, fantastic card in that matchup. It's another one of those cards where you kind of only want to set just Fiendish Chain, right? Let's say you have Fiendish Chain and Deep Prison, and you're playing against Mermills. A lot of times you just set Fiendish Chain, allow your opponent to make that first Marksman play, hopefully stop it with Fiendish Chain, and then in the second and later turns, you start to set Deep Prison when you feel like it's not as likely that they have Marksman. Then we have 2 copies of Bottomless Trap Hole. Again, we're in a format people run Rabbit. This card's obviously good against Rabbit because it hits both monsters. Obviously, if you take a look at the deck that I just profiled, we had a bunch of targets. It's also pretty good against Mermills as well. So double Bottomless, double Torrential Tribute, obviously a fantastic card, and the both of the Solemns, which are at this point limited to 1. So a really robust, heavy trap lineup, a lot of 3-ofs here. Which is interesting. Some trap lineups have a lot of 1-ofs, like 1 Breakthrough Skill, 1 Compulse. I kind of like the lower quantity of overall types of cards, just maximizing them, because at this particular point in Yu-Gi-Oh's history, I think they really worked out well in the format. Let's go on to the extra deck. So the extra deck, there's a lot of debate sort of on some of these slots. I think 2 copies of Tiger King, absolutely necessary. This deck can go into them really easily. You have Rabbit, obviously you have Tensu, so 2 copies of that. There's some debate to run the second Abyss Dweller. In the Mermail matchup, there are circumstances where you actually want to go into 2 Abyss Dwellers, so I can totally understand making room for a second one. I've decided just to put 1 here, and the card I actually cut it for was Chimera Tech. I'll talk about that when I get to the side deck. Then Black Ship, just fantastic card. Shockmaster's a little debatable. I'll talk about that in a little bit. Diamond Direwolf, Utopia, Maystroke, Gaga Cowboy. These guys are all really relatively self-explanatory. There's nothing really cool about any of them. Shockmaster is an interesting one. So this format, the Wind-Up deck, was basically a Shockmaster deck as opposed to the Wind-Up Hunter Loop deck, right? The Wind-Up Hunter Loop was the format prior. Hunter itself was actually banned. So the deck, in a perfect world, if they opened Magician Shark, would have went into Shockmaster. This deck can also put 3 level 4s on the field. This deck, because it's not running the Evolzar package with Sabersaurus, I think this slot is warranted. If you had Dinos in your deck, if you had Sabersaurus in your deck, chances are if you actually got 3 level 4s on the field, 2 of them are dinosaurs, and at that point, Dolka and Lagia are just strictly better. So having the flexibility of at least having 1 sort of pseudo-negation card, maybe you can use this to stop monster effects against Mermails, which is obviously fantastic for a turn, makes it so that I think the Shockmaster, when you're not running the dinosaurs, it's at least a debatable point. You want to put Steel Swarm Roach in here because you think the meta is going to be a lot of Chaos Dragon? Sure, it's debatable. It's not a staple. For the rank 3s, again, this deck's running the tour guides, so we need a few Temtempo, Zenmaines, Leviathan Dragon, Giga Brilliant, and Leviair. Pretty generic ones across the board. This isn't Dino Rabbit where we're trying to use Rabbit on turn 1 and then subsequently on turn 2 and then maybe even other times if you're running Avarice. But the Leviair is useful because you might be able to use somebody else's Rescue Rabbit, right? It's not like you're banishing Rescue Rabbit and you want to use it on the next turn. You're not going to have enough normal monsters for that, so you can't do the Rabbit turn 1, Tour Guide turn 2 sequence the typical Dino Rabbit decks from the previous format used to do. But obviously, like I mentioned, you can still take your opponent's Rabbit. And then Chimera Tech, we'll talk about Chimera Tech in just a moment. Why was this deck using Chimera Tech? Well, it had to do with some of the top decks at the time. So we have, of course, Prophecy or Spellbooks. Spellbook of Judgment was actually going to be released relatively soon, but at this point it was a control pseudo grind deck. This was actually the deck that I played at the YCS in New Jersey, the one that Tyree won, which is in and around this format. You could play this exact deck at that event. So Prophecy is definitely one of the, not absolute top decks, but it's a deck that you could have run into. Dino Rabbit was still a deck. I'm just going to comment on Insectors. It really didn't take up a lot of representation, but it won the first event in the aftermath of some of the restrictions, or one of the early events. I think the first event with Mermails, this deck actually won. So not overwhelmingly popular, but I at least put it down. We have, of course, Gears, which is one of the reasons why you want something like Chimera Tech. I think the best deck, and at this point in time, I never played it. I was sort of trying to always beat it, but it was Mermails. Mermails was just such a tough deck to play against with potentially full Divas, Moulin Glacium, Triple Dragoons, Gen X package if they chose to use it. It was really, really a tough deck to play against. Technically some gear deck or some Machina decks here or there topped, but I was never a huge fan of them. They're often centered around Tin Goldfish and the ability to go into rank 4 really easily with the gadgets, which subsequently can go into Dweller, which yes, if you just Dweller turn 1 with a bunch of traps every game and you play against a bunch of Mermills, yeah, your deck can win. Evil Swarms, but I don't think they were positioned super well. Yes, it can stop Megalo, Abystius, Moulin Glacier. There are some cards in that matchup with the ability to go into Ophion was pretty good, but I think there were too many other decks at the time. So having that as your primary, extra deck monster that's supposed to lock them out of the game isn't the greatest, but it was a deck you could run. Chaos Dragons, there were some limitations. Red Eyes, Darkness, Metal Dragon was at 1, but it was a deck that you could still sporadically see. Obviously, the Mirror Match was popular. Windups was really good. And then another deck that Desmond actually had a lot of success with during this format was a Karakuri, sort of an emergency teleport Karakuri deck. This is one of those formats where I could get pretty exhaustive into the tier 2 and tier 3 decks. There was a Gishki FTK, for example, but I've decided to make it a somewhat limited list. It's one of those formats where, to me, I always think of this as Mermill Firefist format, and then a lot of decks off to the side like Windups. Some people, though, absolutely, you could cite some tier 2 decks that I could include here, but this is really the bulk of what you could anticipate playing against. How are we going to stop it? Well, the primary theme here on the side deck is to make sure that we have the Mermill matchup countered to the best of our ability. So I wouldn't say it was a staple, but a lot of players elected to do the triple Banisher, triple D-Fissure side deck plan. Obviously, if you get any of these on turn 1 against Mermills and they don't have MST or Dark Hole, Book of Moon, and out to this, you're probably going to win the game or be in really good shape because they can't trigger any of their effects. All of the things get banished. Abyss Spear is not nearly as good, etc. The Banishers make a lot of sense because this deck's running double Forbidden Lance, triple D-Prison, double Mirror Force, and then even stuff like Solemn Warning. So you literally have about 10 cards that you could set with a Banisher of the Radiance and be in relatively good shape. So that's where that comes from. And then D-Fissure, obviously, it's just a hot rod for MST, and if they don't have it, they're probably going to lose. What's really unfortunate, going back and looking at this format, is a lot of the times the correct play was to not play around Heavy Storm. It's kind of that one of, if the Mermill player has Heavy Storm, it almost felt like they always beat you because they could do the Megalo, Diva, OTK. And when they pulled that off, it just felt like, what is the point? There's just no way that I can come back from this, right? So as a result, and just so you're familiar with what I'm talking about there, if they go Megalo, Diva, the Megalo brings out Marksman, and then, rather, the Diva brings out Marksman. And then you use the Megalo to ditch the Diva to the grave, and now the Megalo can attack directly or attack twice, and if they have a clear feed, which they probably do after resolving Megalo, the Megalo attacks twice for 24, which is 48. The 1300 off of the Marksman drops you down to 61. And then you go into Atlantean Dragoons, and it's game. Or it's close to game. So that play happened all the time. And I feel like every single time... Actually, Marksman's 14. What am I saying? It is 8,000. I knew it was 8,000. But I felt like every single time I played against that deck, they just OTK'd me with Heavy Storm. In some games where I kept cards in my hand, they pick one off with an MST, then OTK me. So I just got to a point where it's like, whatever. D-Prison or D-Fissure, set 3, go ahead. Or, as I commented on earlier, if you do have that Fiendish Chain D-Prison situation in game 1 when you unfortunately have stuff like that, yes, I understand not just playing around Heavy Storm totally, but some debate in the side deck games. I'm just going to play Fissure, set my back rows, hope to kill you. If you have Heavy Storm, I really can't do anything about it. You know, not every opponent's going to have Heavy Storm within their top 10 cards every game 2 and 3. So that's a little bit of a discussion there. Outside of the Mermill matchup, what else do we have here? Well, I'll stick with the monsters first. Windups is still a deck you have to worry about. So we have double Maxi. It's also good against Karakuri. Also really good against Mermills. Or sorry, not against Mermills. Against Windups. Rivalry of Warlord. It's not the worst against Mermills, but you probably wouldn't side it. Windups. This is actually also pretty good against Dino Rabbit. If you chain this to Rabbit, they can't really do anything at that point. So there's a little bit of flexibility there. We have a couple copies of Cyber Dragon, which is good against the Karakuri deck, good against the Gear deck. Obviously, that's why we had Chimera Tech. We have a couple copies of Dust Tornado. It might seem like overkill with triple MST, but I'm telling you, this was a very grindy format. You do not want your opponent in the Windup matchup to resolve Windup Factory. It's a must kill. You're going to lose if they get 2 or 3 cards off of this, particularly if you're just kind of grinding back and forth with a lot of 1-ups or 1-for-1. So having the ability to kill it on the spot, really important. And then a Thunder King, it's really good going first, particularly with the Bottomlesses, the D-Prisons, all of those cards. You know, you play that turn 1 against something like Windups, you're in good shape. Even in the mirror match, it's not the worst. So against Spellbooks, right? So there's a lot of matchups with that turn 1 Thunder King. I couldn't really find a spot to put in a second Thunder King because I liked the ratio, so I kind of stuck with this. But nevertheless, that's Joe Giorlando for Yu-Gi-Oh! History, taking a look at really the first time that Fire Fists were ever a competitive deck. Thank you for watching. Check back soon for plenty more Yu-Gi-Oh! content.